Dear colleagues, it's my great pleasure to address you at this plenary session of the Baltic Conference on the History of Science, although I cannot do it directly, and please accept my sincere apologies for that. I had committed myself to be teaching here at Shanghai University before it became known that the Baltic Conference will take place in early October. But still, it is a pleasure to have a chance to address the topic of the philosophy of science in Estonia at this meeting, and there is a real good reason to do that this year, but this good reason is not really very fortunate and very lucky one. Namely, in this year 2015, our community has lost two outstanding and active members of the board of the Estonian Association of History and Philosophy of Science, who both also were philosophers of science. In late January, we were shocked by the news that Professor Ülo Kaevats has suddenly died as a result of brief but acute illness. Ülo Kaevats was a philosopher of science by his training, but he was a very active member of society, an outstanding public figure. Therefore, starting from the transitional period in our societies in late 1980s and early 1990s, Ülo Kaevats was more active in politics. He can be called a real statesman, not just a politician. He held many important positions in that field. In addition, for a long period, he was editor-in-chief of Estonian Encyclopedia, which is a big job, and Ülo was very effective fulfilling this position. Therefore, many people in Estonia even do not know that Ülo Kaevats, by his training and by his main focus as an academic, was actually a philosopher of science. And in the middle of summer, in mid-July, we were probably even more shocked by even more unexpected news, very tragic ones. This concerned the news that the most outstanding leading philosopher of science in Estonia, and probably the most influential in all the three Baltic states, Professor Rein Vihalem, has tragically died in a boating accident while fishing, while dealing with his beloved hobby. So unfortunately, neither Ülo Kaevats nor Rein Vihalem is with us anymore. During the second part of my presentation, I address, of course, the ideas of Rein Vihalem in more detail, and also touch about something that Ülo Kaevats did in philosophy of science. He still managed to leave his mark. But let me start from history. Most of my talk is based on the publication that Rein Vihalem wrote with my assistance, and that was published in Journal of General Philosophy of Science in 2007 in volume 38. So everyone who is interested can read about all this in more detail. I'll try to add, if time permits, some brief remarks about the current situation. But first, about history. Now, This academic center in Estonia for a long time was the University of Tartu, of course. In the 19th century, there was nothing else. There was not much philosophy there, and there wasn't anyone who can be called a philosopher of science directly and strictly, but this field even wasn't really fully developed those days. Let me still mention briefly a few names. First, it was Gottlob Benjamin Jesche, who became professor of philosophy in Tartu. Then the university was reopened in 2002. Jesche was a disciple of Immanuel Kant. He came from Königsberg. Jesche probably cannot be called an original thinker in his own right, but he made his mark in history as a publisher of Kant's Logik, and therefore has some remote connection to philosophy of science as well, or at least logic of science. Well, in the second half of the 19th century, Tartu had Gustav Teichmüller. The name of Teichmüller has been mentioned in all detailed considerations, treatments of a history of philosophy. Teichmüller, first of all, is known, of course, by working out his version of personalism called perspectivism. This he really did in Tartu during his stay in 1871 through 1888. And it is believed that his ideas, Teichmüller's ideas, actually influenced Friedrich Nietzsche quite strongly concerning Nietzsche's perspectival theory of knowledge. But why mention Teichmüller at all in the context of philosophy of science? Actually, he can be rightfully mentioned because he has critically reviewed some aspects of Darwinism in his writings, and also the theory of types of Karl Ernst von Baer, one of the well-known Baltic German scientists who worked in Tartu in the 19th century. Well, everybody knows Teichmüller. Many people have heard, at least in our region, also about Jesche, but it is not probably that widely known that such well-known figure in philosophy as Nikolai Hartmann also has close connection to Tartu. Actually, he was a student in Tartu for actually quite briefly, less than 2 years. In early 20th century, he studied medicine, and it is believed that it was actually in Tartu where he got the impulse, the motivation to address some topics of philosophy of biology that he actually did in his very first book. During the intra-war period, Tartu University had, or the whole Estonia just had, one professional, already Estonian at that time, philosopher. That was Alfred Kort. Just like Teichmüller or Jesche or Hartmann, Alfred Kort did not focus on philosophy of science as well. But just like these great predecessors, he touched some of the topics that fall under this category, philosophy of science. These were mostly commentaries of views of our people, the Frenchmen Léon Brunswick and Émile Mayerson, but also he wrote about Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy of organism and principle of causality in modern physics. And that was basically all that happened before World War II. So systematic study in philosophy and methodology of science in Estonia actually started after World War II, or well, we may debate whether it was in 1950s or 1960s, rather in 1960s even. What took place in 1950s in this concern is quite interesting more from an ideological point of view, perhaps, than from a strictly philosophical point of view. But still, let me mention that such interesting figure in the history of Estonia as Gustav Naen back in 1950s managed to protect science against so-called pseudo-philosophy. From an ontological position, he defended the theories of relativity. Back then in Soviet Union, these were considered specimens of backward physical idealism. Gustav Naen was very popular in Estonian society for some time because of his original ideas, but managed to become extremely unpopular some years before his death because of his political views that he expressed during the transition period that concerned mostly his critical attitude towards the aspirations of the independence of Estonia. Back in 1950s, Gustav Naen was supported by a physicist Paul Kard in his criticism, and actually this is an activity with which we can say that the founder of the methodology and philosophy of science in Estonia, namely Lembit Valt, also started his independent academic life, namely he protected genetics against Lysenkoism. Lembit Valt can really be considered the founder of philosophy of science in Estonia, and this is in a best way documented in a collection of papers entitled The Method of Modeling and Some Philosophical Problems of a History of Methodology of Science. This was published in Russian, but still made an important mark on the development of methodological studies of science in the whole Soviet Union, and did it thanks to being published in Russian, of course. But the positions and the original ideas, real original ones of Lembit Valt, unfortunately, really did not become known in the Western countries due to the political situation. Lembit Valt had the chance to visit the Western countries for a couple of times. He managed also to visit the real center of philosophy of science those days, namely London School of Economics and Political Science, and he met some leading figures in the field at that time, and probably could have had a chance to join the community, but this would have meant emigrating from the Soviet Union, and Lembit Valt was not ready to take that step. To put it very briefly, the main focus of Lembit Valt, the core of his original contribution to methodology of science, can be stated as follows. He distinguished between models in the conventional sense and imagined thought models. By the latter, Valt understood definite images of the original, which are formed on the basis of analogies with already known phenomena and objective laws which they obey. A thought experiment, according to Wald, is therefore a rational operation with a model, which reproduces a natural process in accordance with the laws of nature. Let me now go on mentioning another important event in the development of a field under consideration, namely in 1979 another collection of papers, now already in Estonian, appeared called Methodology of Science, and this was compiled and edited by Rein Vihalem, and at least from that year on we can firmly say that Rein Vihalem has been the leading philosopher of science in Estonia and quite influential one also on the international scene. In this collection called Methodology of Science, there is probably still not too much original thought due again to the ideological and political situation in the Soviet Union at the time. What philosophers could do, they could criticize the positions of Western thinkers. That quite often meant real deep analysis. It is the same in this collection. In this connection, I should mention the term forward Marxism that was coined after the dissolution of Soviet Union already. Namely, it was often enough to express sympathy towards Marxism just in the foreword and philosophical treatments, and later on continue with real deep philosophical analysis. I should mention some names whose ideas were addressed and analyzed in this collection called Methodology of Science, like Rudolf Carnap, Karl Popper, Imre Lakatos, and Thomas Kuhn. Now let me concentrate more on the original contribution of Rein Vihalem himself. Being a chemist by his background, by his original training, he was also deeply interested in history of chemistry, and one of his best known publications perhaps actually is his thorough treatment of a history of this field, the story of unfolding of one particular science, ühe teaduse kujunemislugu, which is an interesting and original approach to the history of chemistry and points out very clearly and in very interesting manner, for instance, what is the difference between alchemy and chemistry, why the former one cannot be called science and why the latter is science. Now, what is science? This is a central question for probably all philosophers of science. The same with Rein Vihalem. And he came out with very interesting, original, even I would say, solutions of a problem. As a first step, he added one important concept to the notion hypothetical deductive. It was in use already earlier, this idea that the scientific method by its essence is hypothetical deductive. Rein Vihalem, and here the contribution of Ülo Kaevats is also important. Together they introduced the term constructive hypothetical deductive, emphasizing that no scientist has the capacity to apply the so-called God's eye view, take the God's eye view on the world. We cannot study world as it is. We can only look at it through our cognitive frameworks, and of course we are constrained by our technological means that are at our disposal, that have been developed so far. Well, all philosophers can notice the influence of Immanuel Kant behind this idea, perhaps, but still in philosophy of science it was original. As the next step, Rein Vihalem decided to work out a model of science proper that he called phi science. This phi comes from a first character of a Greek term physica, of course. And now we might ask why we cannot just say that let's take physics as a model and that's it, and each and every science is science to the respect of a likeness to physics, how close it is to physics, how physics-like it is, so to say. But let us not forget that physics is a developing science. It changes, and who knows in which direction. It may well happen that someday not all physics even falls under the framework of science proper, defined clearly by Rein Vihalem. I cannot unfortunately go into the details of this definition. You have to look into Rein's publications yourselves. So anyway, a model is needed, and it is interesting that Vihalem also discovered that in addition to physics, it is just roughly half of chemistry which falls under phi science, satisfies the requirements of the model. So chemistry only partly is constructive, hypothetical, deductive science, and partly it is actually classifying, historical, descriptive. So chemistry is a border case, especially interesting for a philosophy of science. And based on this understanding, Rein Vihalem, together with his international colleagues, actually founded a whole new discipline, philosophy of chemistry. The Society for Philosophy of Chemistry is very active. They hold annual meetings every year. Rein Vihalem was an active participant at many of those meetings. One of those he organized himself in Tartu and Käriku in 2003. Now about the last development in the thought of Rein Vihalem, I cannot address everything I cannot address. For instance, his very interesting considerations from the position of a model of phi science, Ilya Prigozhin's methodology of dissipative structures, for instance. Very interesting publications are available, but let me just say a few words about practical realism. Namely, Rein Vihalem came to the understanding that traditional realist approaches in philosophy of science are not adequate enough in making sense of the scientific method, especially from the point of view of its development that is strongly embedded in history also. Unfortunately, many philosophers of science, mostly those coming from the logical positivist camp, do not recognize the relevance of history of science for philosophy of science. Rein Vihalem was absolutely different in that respect. He considered history of science very important, crucially important for understanding the essence of science. And In his practical realism, he pointed out as the basis of this approach, first of all, of course, that science has to be understood as a practical activity, not just anything theoretical, although it is strongly theory-driven. The theories are important. They are not unimportant at all. And not only a practical scientific activity, namely observation and experimentation is important, but basically everything that surrounds science, its historical background, but also all the norms and ethical considerations that are there in every human society and that influence all our walks of life. Science is not immune from these influences. And this aspect has not been fully recognized in any earlier consideration of the essence of science. So something else, original development and introducing this idea on the international scene to the international community of philosophers of sciences was unfortunately interrupted in a tragical manner this summer. Rein himself cannot do this any longer, so we, his followers, his pupils, have this task. We have to take this up and do the best that we can. Now, just very briefly about the current situation. Philosophy of science in Estonia is alive and kicking, I would say. It is developed both at the University of Tartu and at Tallinn University of Technology. The leader at the University of Tartu is Endla Lõhkivi. I hope Endla is in the audience right now and can give further information about her research team to those who are interested. Concerning Tallinn University of Technology, the chair that was established and developed by Ülo Kaevats was taken over by Professor Ahti Veiko Piedarinen a couple of years ago. Ahti is a leading Peirce scholar in the world, one of the top ones. And Peirce, after all, was a chemist, therefore a scientist, so there is close connection to science, to philosophy of science. I'm afraid Ahti is not present in Riga, but I hope his probably closest colleague at TUT, Amirush Moktefi, is present and is listening to this presentation also and can give further information to those interested about what is being done at Tallinn University of Technology. Well, I myself continue there as well and try to do my best to be still active in my main field. And let me also remind you all about the journal, Acta Baltica Historia et Philosophia Scientiarum web journal is doing very well. There are many submissions, many of them of really high quality. I am just thinking about submitting an application to Scopus. I think it's time to do that already. There is still one big problem as well, and you can probably guess what it is about. It is about funding, about finances, about money. So if anyone has any good ideas in that respect, I would be, and the whole editorial team would be really grateful. But I have to stop here. I wish all the best to the conference that is opening today, and let me also take the chance and invite you to the next Baltic conference on the history of science that is planned to be held in Tartu in the spring of 2017 and will be dedicated to the 250th anniversary of Georg Friedrich Parrot, the refounder of Tartu University, who, as you all know, has a very deep contribution and strong influence on the development of the academia and learned ideas in Latvia as well. Thank you very much for your attention.